Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. I hope that you are all having a wonderful weekend. Today is July 20... What is today? July 25th. Time means nothing these days. I'm still in quarantine. Time is completely relative. And speaking of time, today's episode theme is about time, and specifically, it's about time loops. So, I'm still playing a little bit of catch up with some movies. I promise. I promise you guys, I'm almost there. I'm almost to brand new movies. So my first new movie is Palm Springs, which Shub reviewed about a week and a half ago. He did an excellent job. I strongly recommend you listening to that. But it's also always fun to have some other opinions, have some different sides going on, so that's what I'm going to do here with Palm Springs. My weekly watch is a film from the early 2010s called About Time. It's a rom-com romance movie. Actually, all of these movies today are kind of rom-coms. And then my weekly recommendation is sort of the creation, popularization of this genre as a whole, which is Groundhog Day. And then finally, my final segment, given that it's towards the end of the summer, I'm hoping to cap off the end of the summer with my top 5 summer movies. And so that'll be my top 5 list, and that's today's episode. So I hope you're ready. I'm very excited, and let's get into it. Alright, so Palm Springs. I'm super excited to talk about this. I literally just watched it last night, so I'm still formulating some of my thoughts, and excited to talk it through, talk about my initial thoughts. But it is a film that came out earlier this year, exclusively on Hulu. It stars Andy Samberg and Kristen Milioti. It follows a man named Niles, who is stuck in a time loop at a wedding as his girlfriend is a friend of the bride and accidentally gets another guest stuck named Sarah, and they have to navigate the time loop together. So a kind of an original premise. Obviously, this formula has been done before, stuck in a time loop, sort of a romance movie, but it's pretty rare that that time loop movie involves two people, particularly two people that are of different experience levels in the time loop, or some have been there longer than others and have to learn to like each other, learn to get to know each other, first of all. So that's an interesting dynamic that really switches things around from other time loop-based movies. It's usually one person trying to navigate it. So I like that it's two, both trying to navigate each other and the time loop. And so initial reactions, I really, really enjoyed this movie. This might actually be a theme for the day, kind of showing my biases in film review, because I'm going to tell you a lot of the critical things about this movie that I found, and this goes for this movie, this goes for About Time, this goes for Groundhog Day, but a lot of my opinions on the movie are a lot more subjective than normal, I would say. Usually I would like to think that usually how I feel about a movie kind of lines up with the quality of almost every aspect of that movie, whether it's conscious or subconscious. And these ones actually are not, that's actually not the case in a lot of these movies, at least this one in About Time. There are parts of the movie that I think are that are weak or strong, but then my subjective opinion on the movie kind of doesn't match that as much. So Palm Springs is one of them. I think it's a pretty well done movie. It's fairly strong, but there are also just some lackluster, mediocre points in the movie, but overall I really enjoyed it. And so my bias tends to be towards story and character, and this one has a really strong story, some very likable, entertaining characters. You guys have kind of been along with me for at least part of it, but I've watched a lot of romance movies recently, and it's really rare to find a romance movie where both the main characters are likable. So this was a nice little change of pace. Shub talked about this a little bit in his review, so I won't go too far in depth to it, but it's a pretty nihilistic movie, which basically just is a philosophical way of thinking, kind of saying that there's no rhyme or reason to the universe, everything is random, therefore everything is meaningless. And there are different ways to interpret what that means, and that's a pretty prevailing ideology in a lot of film and television these days, particularly just like later 21st century way of thinking. And recently that switch has kind of gone from everything is meaningless, therefore everything is bad, like a lot of like pessimistic views of it. Now it's moving in towards the direction of sort of an optimistic view of it. And this is one of those movies. This movie has a very optimistic outlook of things towards the end of the film. It's just a pretty enjoyable, charismatic, very charming movie in general. So let's get into why and get into just the nitty gritty of the film. So the screenplay is really solid. There's some really good comedy, I thought personally. A lot of the comedy comes from, it's a mix of the comedy coming from the performances and the comedy coming from the script. So obviously Andy Samberg is a very seasoned comedian on SNL, a very extensive background as far as both written and performance comedy. Kristen Milioti is also very well established as far as the comedic and dramatic world. She's just as much established in the dramatic world as she is in the comedic world. You may know her from How I Met Your Mother in the final season. She was also in Wolf of Wall Street, so she has a pretty good, a pretty solid background, and she shows off her, well, I'll get into her acting in just a little bit, because I think she's fantastic. But both of those performances have a lot of natural comedy coming from it, both from the script and their performances. The one thing that I think stood out to me the most in this film that I really liked was the characters feel like they're making realistic choices. So in a lot of films, things will, because usually a screenwriter has an idea for the beginning, middle, and end, sometimes the choices that characters make may feel forced or sudden because they need to get to that ending, and it's mostly about finding your way to that ending. And so you may feel like some of the choices are a little bit unnatural or a little bit too forgiving sometimes. And what I really liked in this film is that there are times where the characters are apart and there are times where the characters are together, where it feels like they're making choices that are realistic to their character and their psyche, and don't feel forced in any way. And so then when they do come back together, because it's a rom-com, it's a formulaic that things will go really well, and then things will kind of go up in flames, and then things will come back together. So that's hopefully not too much of a spoiler. How that actually plays out and how that ends, I think, is usually the fun part, but that's the rom-com formula. And so the choices between, or the dynamic between the couple with them both making their own separate decisions, I think play out really well. And it feels as though they're making realistic choices with realistic stakes. And for the screenplay as a whole, I think there are some very strong foreshadowing, some really subtle callbacks. I say subtle because there are just some brief lines that don't even get majorly acknowledged all that much, or just some small production things that then come back a little bit later. And in a movie, in any movie, callbacks are a really strong positive, but particularly in a movie about time and a time loop where things keep repeating, I think that's really important. And it's subtle things that aren't even based around the actual full narrative of the film. So I really liked that there were a lot of really strong foreshadowing and some really good callbacks. As far as my critiques of the screenplay, there's a little bit of an epilogue. So there's a pretty clear, well, not clear, it's very ambiguous, but there's a point where the film, I personally believe, should have ended. And then there is 1 to 2, depending on whether you count the credits, scenes later that are no more than 5 minutes altogether. And they kind of are there to make things a little bit more conclusive, or also just to add a little bit of a cheap gag. And I just don't really feel like it's worth it. I'm not a big fan of it. I think I would have liked that ending to be a bit more ambiguous. So don't love the epilogue. And then I also think that some of the morals of the film are pretty are pretty concrete. They're really laid out. There's not a lot of subtlety in the messages or the morals or just what the characters are thinking. Usually, particularly Andy Samberg's character tends to say a lot of the things that he's doing, a lot of things that he's thinking. And so there's not as much subtlety in those dynamics. So I would have actually liked, the film is pretty weird, pretty over the top and crazy at points, but I would have liked this to go an even further route to be even more ambiguous than it already was. So those are my only gripes, I think, with the screenplay. But overall, it's pretty strong screenplay. I think maybe it could have gone through like one or two more passes just to add that level of nuance and subtlety to it. Moving on to the acting, I think the acting is very strong. It really only matters whether Andy Samberg and Kristen Milioti are good, and they are very good, because the rest of the characters, while they're in it a little bit, this tends to be the case with any comedy that has side characters. They are strictly archetypes, strictly kind of over-the-top, theatrical type characters, and in this one in particular, the acting is not all that strong. I actually am a fairly big fan of the I really like Tyler Hoechlin, who plays the husband getting married, because I really liked Teen Wolf. Don't make fun of me, please. It's a fun show. So I thought he didn't have the strongest performance, even in the archetypical acting way. Camila Mendes from Riverdale is also in this, and she has like 5 lines. But the strong stand-up performance as far as side characters go is J.K. Simmons, who has a relatively large role compared to everybody else. And he has a very nuanced role. He goes from being kind of a villain character to being a wise character, and so he has a really nice arc, even though it's not shown as strongly on screen. That kind of comes from the subtleties that are lacking in the screenplay, telling, not showing. But I like his character a lot, and then I just think that Andy Samberg really gets to show off some of his more dramatic chops in this film. I personally hadn't seen him do a lot of that. He obviously has done versions of that in sketches, but it's sort of like an over-the-top dramatic. So I really liked seeing an actual layered performance from him. And then Kristen Milioti, I think, is really strong. She goes through a lot of different emotions. She's a lot more up and down than Andy Samberg is. Andy Samberg tends to go through a much more steady arc, going from kind of tragic, nihilistic character to a bit more optimistic. And then there's a kind of a lovesick point going on, but Kristen Milioti tends to be a bit more up and down because she's experiencing things for the first time, and so I like the manic way that she portrays everything, whether it be the romantic relationship or her own solo side quests. So I thought the two main characters are very strong, which is really the most important thing. Moving on to the production design, I think there is some pretty strong points going on for the production design with the colors. So there's some really bright colors, which is important for the environment that it takes place in. Also just the atmosphere of a wedding and romance, a lot of floral patterns going on. So it's not anything like miraculous as far as the production design. It's just, I think, a really nice vibe that it has going on here. And I also like how Andy Samberg and Kristen Milioti's characters both go through a lot of mental deterioration throughout the movie, given that they're stuck in this time loop, and they have the same article of clothing every time, but the sort of slow deterioration of their clothing represents, I think, the deterioration of some of their mental state in a lot of points, which I really liked. And then they also have some of these more classy costuming, and so when that comes to play, it definitely represents where they are from a mental standpoint. So I like how the costumes kind of represent that in a much more subtle way, since there really is no variation in the costumes. There's really only 2 different outfits, so I like that a lot. The only odd thing I thought with the production design is there is a pretty strong recurring, I don't want to say motif, because I just don't really see a purpose for it. There's a really strong recurring image of beer, and a specific kind of beer. It's not like any known brand, and so just by nature of it not being a known brand, it kind of stands out, and so then it shows up a lot, and so I thought that it was going to have some purpose in the story, or at least some reason to to be there so often and stand out so much, because a lot of the color scheme of the film is blues, very strong blues, and a lot of beer bottles, like beer companies, go with blue as a color for their cans. And this is a red and gold, which stands out pretty distinctly, and so it just felt odd to me. I don't know. That's just something that kind of felt weird, that didn't seem to serve any purpose. Correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't been able to think of any right now, so that's just something that stood out to me pretty distinctly. As far as the cinematography goes, cinematography is pretty solid. There's nothing to write home about. There are some pretty good solo shots, which tends to happen, I think, a lot now. So cinematography, I think, oftentimes is mistaken with just like really pretty shots, which can be the case. Really pretty shots are very good. It's a visual medium. But good cinematography should be reflective of the story. There should be a reason why things are being shown, how they're being shown, how they're being lit. And so sometimes ugly cinematography serves the story really well, quote unquote. So ugly cinematography can be really good cinematography in a lot of cases. And a lot of films, I think, have fairly simple, mediocre cinematography, except for like a couple really strong, picturesque, like you could frame it on a bedroom wall, shots. And that happens, I think, a lot. And that's sort of something that this movie suffers from, where it's like pretty solid cinematography. I like the color grading. It's very bright. The use of different lights and darks to emulate sort of romance, I think, is really strong in a lot of places. But overall, the cinematography isn't anything like super great. But then there are a couple shots that I think are supposed to be the shots like for the trailer and for the posters. And so particularly some shots in the pool, some overhead shots. Some shots with the visual effects that look a lot more staged. And so it's not bad cinematography, and a lot of those shots I think are there for a reason. I think they're really good shots, but I would have liked that to translate throughout the rest of the cinematography. Because one of the things is that there are a couple like choices that are made for some of the close-up shots that I thought were just kind of odd. That's a lot of this film. Like, none of the choices are inherently bad, but a lot of them just seem like unmotivated or strange. So there's some shots that are like, if you've ever seen Mr. Robot, they're known for close-up one-shots of characters like at the bottom left-hand corner, the bottom right-hand corner, to like have a lot of headspace. And that kind of happens in this one, from like a low angle a lot of times, but it just doesn't seem to serve any purpose. It just seems kind of odd to me. And so there's just some weird choices that are made with the cinematography that I think having a stronger sense of what the cinematography is trying to convey, I think would have been a lot better, and would have stood out a lot more than just kind of having this, interesting cinematography look, but nothing that kind of stands out narratively to me. But that being said, the visual effects I thought were very strong. For a film that is a goofy romantic movie, sometimes things with visual effects get thrown to the wayside, or having them be really goofy is okay. And the visual effects here are still kind of goofy, but when they are there, they stand out pretty distinctly. The colors stand out a lot, and the camera movements within the visual effects scope, I think, work really well too. The editing I thought was really nice, because there's moments where we're going back in time, obviously, to see what's going on, see things from other characters' perspectives. It's relatively told from Niles, Andy Samberg's perspective, but there we definitely get some moments of just Sarah, which I think is really nice. And so we'll go back to where that moment might have started, and then go from one character and then go to the next character like 20 minutes later. So repeating scenes I think is really important for a movie about time, and I think it works really well here to gain more context for the viewer. If you have seen Groundhog Day, the cue for like waking up is a song being played, and so having here in this film, having it be like a dialogue or just a specific line, I think is really creative, because then that line takes on a different meaning every single time the two characters wake up, which I really like. And so I think that's a strong use of sound design in this film. And then as far as directing goes, the directing is pretty solid. Max Barbacow, I don't know how to pronounce it, I'm sorry, repeats scenes very well, because there are scenes that come back later on in the film. I'm sure they were probably shot at the same time as the scenes that come earlier in the film, but I think the attention to detail is pretty strong here, whether it be in the dialogue, the production, or just some of the character choices that are being made here. So very strong attention to detail, pretty solid directing, but there are some choices for just the film as a whole that I think would have been stronger if there had been a stronger theme going on with those choices, at least made apparent on a first viewing. So that's Palm Springs. I think there are some things that could have been improved on, but like I said, this is going to show my biases because I think the story is fairly strong, the acting is very strong, and it's just a really enjoyable summer film that has a pretty optimistic look of things, even in a nihilistic ideology, particularly a film like for quarantine, because it's about a time loop. It's like things are just repeating, and that's kind of what it feels like right now, and this has kind of an optimistic view of that. So I really liked that aspect of it. So I'm going to give this film a strong 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed it. There are some things could have been improved on, probably could have been a little bit more subtle, some stronger choices as far as the more technical production stuff goes. So that's Palm Springs. I really enjoyed it. I would strongly recommend it. It's free on Hulu right now. And for the rest of the episode, I'm going to be talking about my weekly watch, which was About Time. And then I'm going to talk about my weekly recommendation, which is Groundhog Day. And then the final segment, stay tuned because I'm going to run down my top 5 summer flicks of all time. And that's the episode. So stay tuned. And right now we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review of Palm Springs. I'm now going into my review of About Time, and then I'm going to review Groundhog Day as well as run down my top 5 summer flicks of all time. So right now is About Time, which is a film from 2013. It stars Domhnall Gleeson and Rachel McAdams. It's directed by Richard Curtis, who you may know from Love Actually. It follows Tim, who at the age of 21 finds out that all the men in his family can travel through time, and so he uses that to influence both his love life and his life at large, with consequences unforeseen at the time. So this is also a rom-com that centers around time. I would say that's more of a rom-com, I think, than Palm Springs, for sure. I will also say that I had a lot higher expectations going into About Time than I did for Palm Springs. I knew very little about Palm Springs, hadn't really read any of the reviews, so I was just kind of going into it blindly. About Time, a lot of people had hyped this movie up to me as a really romantic movie. I love rom-coms. Just a really creative rom-com, too. I also really like Domhnall Gleeson and Rachel McAdams. So I had much higher expectations for this movie. And because of that, you get to see some more biases in my reviewing. I am not a big fan of this movie. I really didn't like it as much as I wanted to. I know a lot of people love this movie, so I think it's just not my cup of tea. No pun intended. But just not my favorite on a first watch, and I'll explain why. Because I think a lot of the production side of things are actually pretty strong, or at the very least, not weak. Even stronger, you might say, than Palm Springs. But I just think that the way that the story and the characters were worked on and shown through this film just was not as big a fan compared to Palm Springs. Or just compared to any romantic movie. I'm comparing to Palm Springs because that's what I'm reviewing, and I liked Palm Springs a lot. But just in general, I didn't like how some of these plot points and characters were treated. Okay, so right off the bat, the screenplay is an extremely fun premise. I really like the twist on things as far as a romance movie goes, with influencing it by time. Because a lot of romance movies talk about like build up to the meet cute, and talk about like what could happen, what could have happened. And so the fact that a character can actually influence that within the world of the story, I think is really fascinating. But that being said, I don't think it is handled as interestingly and just as expertly as I would have wanted. So I say that because early on in the film, and then basically just early on, within the first, I would say 30, 40 minutes, the time travel plays a really pivotal role. And then it kind of gets sidelined through the rest of the movie to become more of a romance movie, which isn't a bad thing. I think that kind of happens in Palm Springs too. Okay, that'll be I promise it's my last time comparing to Palm Springs. They're very different movies. But in this one, I think it's fine that it gets sidelined for the romance. This is a romance movie. Richard Curtis is kind of known for that. That's sort of his thing. But the fact that the story is such high concept and so strong, I would have liked those plot beats about the time travel to be spaced out a little bit more, as opposed to being like really chunked in the beginning and then sort of spread out a lot more through the middle and the end, and it's just not as interesting when it takes a back seat. I also think that there are a lot more interesting ideas within the confines of time travel that are not explored. So one of those is the relationship with the father, who can also travel through time. That gets kind of hinted at, and maybe this shows that the film did a better job with the subplots than the main plot, but I actually think the relationship between the father and the son, with time traveling that gets kind of referenced a couple times, is way more interesting, than the relationship between somebody who can't time travel or doesn't know that he can time travel. So I really like the father-son relationship, and I wish that would have been delved into a little bit more, or even have that be the bulk of the film. I don't know. That's just me. I think that's a lot more of an interesting idea. Also, as far as the screenplay goes, the main reason why I'm not a big fan of this movie is because I just don't think Tim is a likable character. So it follows Tim. A lot of romantic movies. It's fascinating to me that most romantic movies follow the male character, and that's just seen as a romance movie. And then a romance movie that follows the female character is a chick flick. I think that's just like wrong. Like, it's just kind of dumb. But regardless, most sort of like romance movies most romance movies are kind of male led, or at least the most quote unquote respected ones in Hollywood. Again, dumb, but that's just how things are right now, I guess. And so in this one, because it follows Tim, and Tim, we personally know that Tim has this ability. Seeing him use the ability in timelines that don't necessarily have consequences for him because he can go back, it just doesn't show that he's a likable person. And I don't think he goes through nearly as strong an arc as other films that involve time travel. You'll see both in the one that I just reviewed and I didn't say Palm Springs. Don't get mad at me. And in Groundhog Day. But in this one, I just don't think there's a very strong arc for his character. I think in the timelines that don't have any consequences for him, or the timelines that he just goes about his day and doesn't use time travel, he's a pretty charismatic guy, pretty charming, pretty sort of loves life, optimistic dude, and that kind of persists throughout the rest of the film. And then by the end of the film, he kind of stays that way. But then in the timelines that don't show any consequences, I think he is selfish. There are moments, particularly in the confines of the relationship, that feel very manipulative because of the fact that Rachel McAdams' character doesn't have any idea that he can time travel. He'll find out information and then use that information, which tends to be a running theme in a lot of time travel movies. But in this one, I don't think it's handled nearly as well, because I just don't find Tim very likable. And maybe that's a thing that's like a personal thing to me. But I just think that the way that they show his character when other people won't know his actions just don't bode well. So seeing a character basically alone in terms of the story, he's not a fun guy. He's not a guy that I enjoy watching very much. I think he's sort of manipulative and selfish. So not a big fan of Tim. I think Domhnall Gleeson does have a pretty good performance, so we'll move on to performances. That's the main reason why I didn't like this film. I think Domhnall Gleeson does a very good job. I think him and Rachel McAdams have really good chemistry, which again, very strong for very important for romance films. And then when they are in their relationship, I think it's overall pretty good, but there are some moments where Tim is like flirting with the idea of not being like as faithful. Or there's a moment also where one of the big things is that I don't think Tim there's no consequences for him. There are moments where there's almost a consequence and then he'll like learn how to get out of it and then just not do it again. But he doesn't actually suffer the consequence of his actions. There are also moments where just okay, I'll talk about this moment because it really peeved me. Minor spoiler for the movie, but it's not a strong spoiler. So there's a point where Tim screws up a moment for Rachel McAdams' character. Sorry, my mind is blanking as to what her character's name is. So let's look it up real quick. Handy dandy IMDb, Mary. Okay, thank you. Sorry. So there's a point where Mary has a really important moment in her life, and Tim kind of screws it up by being neglectful and just irresponsible. And right when we see that there's some kind of consequence for him, that he's going to own up to it, her problems get totally sidelined because something happens in his family that they need to go attend to. And so right when we're about to deal with Mary's problems, it doesn't matter because we go right back to Tim's problems. So I really didn't like that. I just don't think Mary gets any points where she gets to show her just kind of the multifaceted layer of her character in a relationship when she's not being hunted down by this man. So but they both have just good performances in the character that they're given. I just don't think the characters are all that strong. The one character that I do really like though is Bill Nye, not the science guy, Bill Nye, Nighy, who is a really strong character actor. He's one of those actors that you see every now and then and you're like, oh, who's that? I know that guy. But you don't maybe not know his name. So he was in the last couple of Harry Potter movies. He's just a pretty well-known British character actor, and he plays the father who can also time travel. And I said that I really liked the dynamics between the father and the son, and part of that is because of Bill Nye. He just has a really cute performance. It's a really heartfelt family portrayal of old age with time travel. Oh man, I just think he's really great. I would have loved the movie to be about him and Tim and sort of the growth of Tim through the eyes of his much older, much wiser father. And so I really like the conversations that they have. I think Bill Nye has a really sweet performance. So that's the part of the movie, performance and character-wise, that I do really, really enjoy. The production design though, so the rest of the film, the technical aspects, I actually think are fairly strong. So the production design for most of the film is fairly cluttered and messy, which I think just feels very natural. So a lot of it seems as though Tim doesn't really know where his head's at for a lot of the film, doesn't really know what to do with his life, and I think the production design represents that a lot of times. It also just feels very natural that real characters would be really cluttered and messy. Nothing feels perfected. It kind of feels like a more real relationship, even in this fantastical world, which I think is very important. With the cinematography, it is solid. There's again kind of no standouts. The moments that stand out a little bit there are some moments of slow motion, which can sometimes feel cheap, especially in romance movies. It adds sort of a dramatic layer of things that kind of tells the audience, oh, this is something to be paying attention to, this is dramatic. I think those moments are filmed fairly well. They look very pretty, but I just think that might be a little bit cheap as far as a narrative device. The color grading I do think looks pretty good though. It's pretty strong color palette where the colors pop really well in a much more natural world with a lot of greens and tans and grays. It's just like having those colors, particularly the color red, pop really. That's just a really nice thing to be looking at. The one part of cinematography that I didn't really like that much, there's a scene that takes place completely in the dark, which is fine, but it's not met with any sort of like poignant moment. Like, it is the point where they meet, but there are time jumps in it, and it's not a scene that is like elongated very much. I would have wished that scene was either really short or really long. I actually would have preferred it to be really long. I think that's really fascinating, but I think this is sort of a more mainstream not blockbuster, but like mainstream mass appeal movie, so that probably would have turned some people off from it. But because it's sort of like hovers in that in the middle state, it just feels out of place to me. Cause it's a little bit too conceptual to be in a mass appeal movie, but then it's not short enough to not feel awkward. So that's just me. I thought that scene was a little bit odd. For the editing, what's really nice here is the time travel never really gets confusing. The rules are laid out pretty strongly, and then the film, from like a technical aspect, abides by those rules. So I thought that was a really solid understanding of the story that manifests in the editing. As far as the sound goes, it has a really nice soundtrack. There's a song that I've been obsessed with called How Long Will I Love You by Ellie Goulding ever since this movie came out. And actually hearing it in the context of the story, that was really, really nice, really cute. The rest of the soundtrack is also very cute, kind of has this like folky pop thing going on that definitely feels very romantic. There's a use of buskers in the film that there are songs that they'll play that then get juxtaposed in the soundtrack that I think is really nice, adds sort of a natural context to the sounds that we're hearing. As far as the directing goes, like I said, Richard Curtis has a really strong sense of romance movies, and that is the strong suit in this one. So while I would have liked the time travel to be spaced out a little bit more, kind of more fluid throughout the film, the sense of love and romance I do think is very strong, and he has a very good job. Very good handle of that. I think he focuses a little bit too much on Tim, which is why I would have liked that dynamic to be more about the father and the son, because I think Rachel McAdams just doesn't have much to do if it doesn't have any relevance to Tim. And that, I think, even though it is from Tim's perspective, I think that just is somewhat of a weak point in screenwriting when it's like a couple and we only get one perspective. Even if it's from his perspective, I would have liked some moments where we actually get a more layered performance from Rachel McAdams that's actually outlined in the screenplay, as opposed to just her kind of making it up for herself, which she kind of does already. But yeah, that is about time. I would have liked this one to be a lot stronger. I do think it is romantic to an extent if you can get past how bad of a character Tim is, so I didn't find it all that romantic. But it has that sort of like air of romance, but as a whole, I can't say that I personally recommend this one. I know a lot of people do love it, so I might be in the minority here. But ask your friends maybe who've seen it. It is on Netflix, so it's 2 hours. If you really want to watch something romantic and this is the one that kind of stands out to you, totally watch it. Just not my favorite. Not my greatest recommendation here. So I'm going to give this one a soft 4 out of 10. Yeah, not the best. Would have liked it to be a lot better, but it's also not like insultingly bad. But that is about time. Stay tuned for the rest of the episode where I talk about my weekly recommendation, which is Groundhog Day. And finally, I will talk about my top 5 summer films of all time. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of Palm Springs as well as About Time. I'm now going into my weekly recommendation, which is Groundhog Day, and then I'll be talking about my top 5 summer films of all time. So right now is Groundhog Day, which I'm really excited to talk about because it's my weekly recommendation, but I actually don't think that it's my favorite of the day. I really liked Palm Springs, and as far as my weekly recommendation goes, I picked this one as my weekly recommendation when I was kind of planning this episode, but I hadn't seen it since I was probably like 10 or 12. I just remember loving it, and so I thought I should probably watch this again, figure out why I liked it so much, and I don't think I liked it as much as I watched it as much as I did the first time. I still did really like it. I think it's a really strong movie, but kind of for different reasons, I think, than when I was younger. And I also just don't think it's my favorite of the day. I think it's probably an unpopular opinion that I like Palm Springs better than Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day is a very respected comedy, but I don't know. I didn't like it as much as I did the first time, but I still am going to keep it as my weekly recommendation because I want to be like transparent with you guys that I had picked it, and I watched it. So I want to talk about it still. And I do still really like this movie, just not as much, as I had in the past. So Groundhog Day is a film from 1993. It stars Bill Murray, and Andy McDowell. It's directed by Harold Ramis. It follows Phil, who's a weatherman who has to report on Groundhog Day from Punxsutawney every year and hates it. And then, of course, he gets stuck in a time loop there on Groundhog Day. Has to figure out a way out by becoming a better person and trying to improve himself. And also his relationship with his producer, Rita. So that's Groundhog Day. I'm sure a lot of you have already seen this movie, but if you haven't, I do strongly recommend it. It's a very well-respected movie. It kind of I'm not going to say it invented it because I'm pretty confident that it didn't invent the time loop idea, but it definitely popularized it. I think when people talk about time loop movies, they reference Groundhog Day most of the time. It's definitely the most popular of the bunch, and it kind of has that formula, or kind of created that formula, improved upon that formula, and has that down really well. It's fun too, because anything that is sort of the early part of any decade will reflect mostly the last decade, or at least as far as like the future generations understand it. So this definitely feels like the last hurrah of like 80s comedies, even though it's 1993. The like goofy, younger, maybe even less mature comedies, I think, of the 90s were just about to get started, really, and create that sense of what the 90s films were about. And so this one definitely feels like an 80s film, even though it's 1993, and it has a kind of charm to it because of that. But let's talk about what I thought about this film and some of the technical aspects of it. So I was surprised because the screenplay is a lot more dramatic than I remember. I remember finding this film absolutely hilarious, and maybe it's because I'm just a little bit older. Maybe it's because I had already seen it before. I don't think this film is all that funny from a written standpoint. Obviously, Bill Murray and Andy McDowell both have really strong comedic chops. Even Chris Elliott, who I think has a little bit of a weaker performance, but regardless, I think a lot of them have just very strong comedic presences, and so a lot of the comedy I think comes from them, which is very different than I think a lot of other comedies, that the comedy's like written really intensely into the script, because it's also not really improv'd, at least as far as I can tell. It's written in the script, but I think where the comedy shines is how that line is either read, or the facial expressions with that line, just the acting that goes behind it. So as a whole, the screenplay is pretty dramatic. And there are some, I hate like talking about this. I don't really talk about it very often because I don't think it's really true necessarily. The whole idea that like an older film couldn't be made or released nowadays. I don't think that is a sentiment that's true if you're looking at things really from like a respectful way. Ultimately, there are movies that have come out in the past that I think don't really fly nowadays, but if they were to be made nowadays, I think just things would be treated more respectfully, or maybe that joke shouldn't have even been made in the first place. But regardless of my personal opinions on that, there are some points in this film that I was like very surprised by. I was like, okay, yeah, that definitely would not happen in a movie today. There's a pretty pretty long scene involving multiple suicides, which is, I remember being a very funny part of the film, because it is treated with a lot of comedy, but it's a lot more tragic and a lot more like heavy than I think I was willing to even comprehend when I was younger. And so just the film as a whole is kind of seeped in this sense of like melancholy, even though it's a comedy, which is weird, but I kind of respected it for that. I kind of liked that it was like a much more dramatic comedy. And the comedic moments come from realness. So much like Palm Springs, again, bringing it back. This is just the Palm Springs episode. But much like that film, the characters make very real choices, and the comedy comes from real moments as opposed to like really over the top moments, because the story is already over the top. The characters don't really have to make any of these over the top choices to have the comedy play out. So I thought that was really nice, and adds to like just the subtlety of the story. And so that's where the comedy comes from. I was really happy because I really hated Phil in the beginning of this movie, and even towards the middle end of this film, I was like, this is going nowhere. Phil sucks. I hate Bill Murray because he's like a perfect prick. Like, he sucks, and we know it. The film knows that you're supposed to really hate him, and by the end, he has a really great redemption arc. I think he goes through like, there's a point like halfway through the film where I guess I just wasn't really paying attention to like how long I've been watching the film, because I thought it was like, oh, we're almost done. Like, we're at the climax or the third act, even though we were probably like halfway through, or I was halfway through. And so I was like, there is no redemption. This is bad. This is like manipulative, and it's stupid, and I don't like it. And then he learns from it, and then the arc happens, which is something that didn't happen in About Time. And I really liked this redemption arc. I think it's a very strong redemption arc that feels really real. And all of those character beats, whether it be him or Rita or even Larry, I think those character beats feel very natural and work really well in context of the story. So I think it's a very strong screenplay. If you're a little bit older and have either seen this film before or just are used to sort of like really fast-paced comedies from nowadays, I would go into this film expecting more of a drama, really. It's a lot less funny than I expected, but I actually don't think that's a downside. I actually think that's a strong suit of the film, and then you'll be pleasantly surprised when there are those comedic moments in the film. So I had said that Bill Murray is a terrible guy in this, and he does a great job at it. And I also just think that Bill Murray is such a strong comedic actor. It's taken for granted how good he is. He's at sort of like, at this point in his career, this is sort of like the end, I think, of like the height of his career. Obviously, the height of his career was probably like the 80s, but this still kind of plays into like his public persona, the persona that he's built over multiple films, and just sort of the sarcastic, still somewhat lovable character persona that he has going on. And so this still falls into that like height of his career, whether it be bookended, and he just is really good at it. He really has those moments between characters. He is really good at creating chemistry between characters, even that we've only seen on screen for a couple minutes. So Bill Murray is just a fantastic comedic actor, and he really shows that in this film. And I also think Andie MacDowell does a really great job. I don't know much about her. I have not seen a lot of films starring Andie MacDowell, but she has some really fun comedic moments. I think her responses to Phil feel very, I mean, I'd said it a little bit earlier, they do feel very natural, but they also feel like she has a lot of like self-respect and a lot of integrity, that she's not willing to kind of take any crap from Phil, even though she's the producer and has to do certain things. From a relationship dynamic in the workplace, it's like she'll do the things she has to, but as a relationship between the two characters, that feels very natural for most of the film. And her responses to how annoying of a character he is, I actually do feel like works really well from her perspective. Sorry, I keep tripping over my words because I'm just like very excited to talk about this movie. Because my opinions have changed, and it's not very often that your opinions on a movie change that drastically. So I just think that she does a really great job, and she has a very strong character in this film. The side characters, like most comedies, are very goofy, really fun. The only one, Chris Elliott, who plays Larry, I think is a really strong character actor. But in this one, it's a little bit earlier in his career, and just don't think it's as strong a performance from him. But all of the other side characters that are really goofy, like Ned, are super fun to watch and very funny. As far as the production design goes, I think the production design in this film is really great. This is a really good example of production design that doesn't, or just any technical aspect that like doesn't throw it in your face about how good it is, how strong it is, but it really fits the narrative of the film. So particularly for Bill Murray's character, Phil, his makeup goes through a really natural deterioration along with his character, that like by the time that he's like really beaten down by this day, it looks it. The makeup is really strong, for his character, which I thought was really great. I also think what was really great in this film is that even for, a film that takes place in the 90s, the costuming feels a little outdated. So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I was not alive in the 90s, I was not alive in 1993, but as far as what I can tell, a lot of the costuming feels like it would have even fit in like the 50s or the 60s. Like there's a lot of older characters, and I think that actually reflects the boring mundaneness, monotony of this town, at least as through Phil's eyes. And so so the costuming feels really outdated, which feels not very outdated, but just like really simple, and then somewhat outdated. And I think that really fits how Phil sees this town. And so I think that's a really strong choice that I really liked. And so the production design in this film I think is very, very strong. Like most comedies, again, the cinematography is pretty functional. There's nothing that really stands out all that much for the cinematography. Even the lighting I don't think is anything to get really enthusiastic about. It's pretty simple. It's pretty plain. In some places even the lighting is a little bit boring. So the cinematography is pretty functional. There are, like About Time, there are some moments where there's slow motion, which is always supposed to point something out, get people like focusing on what's happening. And the points where there are slow motion tends to be during like the suicide moments. So was not particularly a big fan of that. I think it probably could have been like a little bit more tasteful than it was. But at least it adds some variety as far as the filmmaking goes. So there is that, but that's not my favorite aspect of it. So the cinematography I think is probably the weakest part of this film. The editing, though, I do think is really strong because there's an effective use of montage. The montage, I think, where most of the comedy comes from, because we get the chance to, I mean, comedy comes from like repetition of things a lot of times, where it's like things repeating in different ways and playing with your expectations of what that is. So I think the montages do a really good job of that. And because Bill Murray is such a good physical comedic actor, those really play into his strengths in a lot of places. And it also, I talked about this last week with The Platform, where there are moments where the movie could get kind of boring because we're seeing the same things play out. Adding the montage aspect of it really kind of spices things up a little bit. And so the moments where there are montages, I think, are really strong, adds to the comedy. But then when there are not montages, there are some times where we're seeing full days play out or partial days play out, and I think sometimes the cuts happen a little bit too early. It's nice that the film is not treating its audience as stupid, that it's treating the audience really respectfully, and it's assuming that you're able to draw those conclusions from certain things. But I think there are some moments where the cuts happen a little bit too early in the days and maybe expecting even a little bit too much from the audience, or even not expecting too much, because I think you can draw what they're trying to do, but I think there is some comedy that could have been added from the moments that are cut a little bit too soon, at least for me. The soundtrack is a lot of fun here. It's really tongue-in-cheek. The first film that plays is Weatherman, I believe. I assume it's called Weatherman. It's like I'll Be Your Weatherman, which I think is just fun. The soundtrack just adds to the silliness of the movie. There's also, at the very end of the film, the lyrics are pretty on the nose as to what's actually happening, which I think doesn't downplay anything. I think that's just sort of the nature of what kind of a comedy it is. And then obviously I Got You Babe by Sonny and Cher, that is playing on the radio every day, becomes so monotonous and like kind of tragic at points. So it's a choice that is like not apparent as like the theme of the song, at least as far as I can tell. But just the tone of it fits really well for the morning. So I like that choice for the soundtrack. The soundtrack is very tongue in cheek. As far as the directing, Harold Ramis was a strong director and then also a strong actor, so I think he knows how to work with actors really well, and that shows, particularly the actors that he is working with here. He has a pretty strong relationship, I think, with both Bill Murray and Andie MacDowell, but Bill Murray in particular, obviously, Ghostbusters, they know each other pretty well, and he even has a little bit of a cameo that kind of shows how well he knows his actors and can act with them, so I think you can definitely tell how strong, how comfortable his actors feel in these roles. He has a strong focus on character, which is really important in movies like this that have a high concept but a really repetitive story. Focusing on the characters is obviously very important, and that redemption arc that works so well, I think, comes from the directing and how finely treated these characters are from Ramis's perspective. And I think he does a really good job finding realness in the absurdity of the whole situation. So a lot of those character moments come from realistic choices in scenes that don't make any sense. And I really like that juxtaposition because there's no need to make that comedy over the top when the story already is. So I think that's really strong. My extra final notes on this film, there are some fun moments. I forgot to mention this with the cinematography. There are some fun moments that are also kind of tongue-in-cheek with, or there's like a 2001: A Space Odyssey reference, which I think is just kind of goofy and fun. And there are some other sort of camera moments that stand out intentionally and draw attention to themselves, which I think is totally fine in a movie like this. But yeah, this film is a lot more edgy and morbid and dramatic than I expected, which I think is a little bit of a pleasant surprise, but a little bit of a content warning for anybody just to be aware of going into this. I think it's a little bit of an outdated film as far as just modern sensibilities with things like that, and so definitely take that into consideration when deciding to watch it, but I do think it is worth the watch. I think it's very enjoyable, very fun, has really fun characters, some really fun acting, some good character moments. So I really like Groundhog Day. It is a classic for a reason, and I think it still stands the test of time overall and deserves to be in that category. So I really like this one. I'm going to give this one a solid 8 out of 10. But yeah, that's Groundhog Day. I think it's really great. Not as great as I remembered it, but still very, very strong. So that's my review of Groundhog Day, and now we're going to be talking about my favorite summer films of all time, getting a little bit of a mix-up here, not talking about time-based movies, but just some of my favorite films for the end of the summer. So stay tuned for that while we take our final quick break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my reviews of Palm Springs, About Time, and Groundhog Day in this very time-centric episode. But right now, we're gonna get out of that mold and talk about summer films because it is almost August, which means summer is coming to a close. So what better way to cap the summer off with talking about some of my favorite summer films of all time? This is a fun list to put together. There are some movies that I've talked about in the past already more extensively that I would have put on this list that I didn't end up putting on this list because I've talked about elsewhere. So like Booksmart would probably be on here. That's a pretty good summer movie. So these films don't necessarily take place in the summer. Most of them do, but they're mainly just sort of like the feeling of summer. Summer is a time that's like, for most people, feels very like fun, exciting, warm, and so that's sort of the vibe that we're going for today. And so it's a fun list to put together. Hopefully somewhat of a diverse list for film genres because I think it's important to have that on any list. I do that pretty often. So let's get into some of my favorites. Number 5 is Jaws. Jaws is, I don't think I could have not put this one on the list. So obviously it's one of Steven Spielberg's first really great movies. It's totally a classic, but I think a lot of people, maybe my age, maybe a little bit younger, it's a classic that people might have skipped over a little bit. And the reason that it would be kind of blasphemous not to put this on the list is because it was considered the first blockbuster film ever. So for some added context, most films ever since like the 30s before getting a wide release would go on like road shows. They would go kind of town to town to get opinions, to get some hype built up for the film. And then they would come out in a wide release, and then even in a wide release, it would be spread out as to when people would see it. So it was never before like the 60s, really, films most of the time were never really shown at the same time. Even a film that was built on the twist, like Psycho, there was sort of a campaign going on with the film that you weren't supposed to share the ending because people hadn't seen it yet. So most of the time films were not released at the same time. And then after the 60s, really the sideshow, roadshow kind of went away. But still it was hard to get films out at the same time everywhere until Jaws. And Jaws did it. Jaws came out pretty much everywhere, at the same time. It was one of the first, I don't think it was the first, but it was one of those first movies to do it. And it was just so shocking for a lot of people. So it had a PG rating at the time because PG-13 didn't exist. And I think a lot of people probably would have expected it to get an R rating because there is some gore, there are some jump scares in the movie. I think for a modern audience, it's a really good introduction to horror films because it isn't really that scary. I think for just modern sensibilities, because I think we're so overstimulated in a lot of ways. So it's not really as scary, but there are still some horror moments. And if it's not scary, it's a really good kind of like action film, and like monster movie in general. It pioneered a lot of film techniques, particularly with Bruce the Shark, who was named on set. I think it was named after like one of the producers. I'm pretty sure. I didn't look that up, so don't get mad at me, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. But it innovated a lot of stuff. It takes place at the beach, takes place during the summer, and it's a really good group watch. It's really fun to kind of just like talk about this movie during it, get really excited about it, because it's just an exciting movie, whether you think it's scary, whether you think it's more action-packed, and even the characters are met with a lot of really good, dramatic moments for these characters. So I just think it's a very strong movie, and I think I would be remiss not to put it on the list. So number 4 is one that I would have loved to put in my favorite musicals of all time, but because I was talking about musicals that hadn't been a stage play beforehand, it didn't fit. But it is my favorite movie musical, which is Grease. Sing Street's my favorite movie musical. So sorry about that. It's Sing Street, but then it's Grease. Grease is just so fun. It's so goofy and like charming. It's a love story that takes place during school, but it talks a lot about summer. And it just kind of has that sense of like young love and, like nostalgia, because it's a film that came out in the 70s, but it's about the 50s. And it's a film that I think a lot of people have strong memories attached to from your childhood, whether it be the movie or the musical. And so I know that it's a very nostalgic film for me, and it just has that sense of nostalgia, which I think goes along with summer in a lot of ways, a lot of the time. It's a musical, which is always fun. So it's a really important summer movie to me is a movie that you can watch with people and maybe even talk through some of it and still really enjoy it. And Grease definitely fits that mold. So I just love Grease. It's just cute. It's charming. It's fun. It's nostalgic. It's the perfect summer flick. Number 3 is what I put in place of Booksmart, because I've talked about Booksmart a lot. But this one is a movie that is similar, I think. I'll not compare it to Booksmart. It's just kind of about youngness. It's about growing up. And so this one was called The Way, Way Back. I think it's pretty underrated. It is a film about, it's a coming of age story about a young boy in a beach town over the summer, and his family, his romantic escapades. So I think it's just a really enjoyable film, but it's also a movie that, compared to a lot of the movies on this list and just a lot of coming of age movies, there are some really, really real stakes, I think, that feel, or stakes that they're emotional stakes, but they feel really necessary to the character and really important to the character and between the character dynamics and the relationships between people. So I think that that's a really strong suit of this film that sets it apart from everywhere else. It is totally a summer movie. It takes place like at a beach town and a water park, and this doesn't make any sense, but it like feels like a sunburn. The movie, like, it's like kind of hard to watch, but like it's just a warm feeling. I don't know, maybe that was like not a ringing endorsement. Sunburns aren't fun, but like sitting in the sun is fun and can feel really warm and nice, and that's what this movie feels like. So hey, I can say what I want about it. I think it's a fun movie. It's also very uplifting. By the end of the film, it's fairly dramatic, but it's probably the most dramatic of the films, but still has this sense of positivity both in the beginning and the end of it. Young love is always a fun thing to be watching on screen for a summer movie, for an enjoyable film. So I think it's pretty underrated. I would definitely recommend this one. And that's The Way Back. And speaking of young love, my number 2 pick is Moonrise Kingdom. This is one that takes place over the summer. It takes place at a summer camp. It's a Wes Anderson film, so it's kind of the whole package. It's a really cute romance movie between 2 young kids. It's quirky. It's weird. It's very, very funny. I think it's one of his funniest. I think it's one of his most relatable, because the comedy comes from the relationship and just the quirkiness of the kids, and because like a lot of times there are larger messages that I think feel like they may even be forced into Wes Anderson movies. I think in here they flow very naturally, because the movie is weird, and a lot of times kids are really weird, and particularly the kids in this one. So I think it's just kind of the full package. It's warm, it's cute, takes place during the summer. It's just very, very enjoyable, and it's my favorite Wes Anderson film, and just one of my favorite rom-coms in general. Oh, it also has a really great climax. It has a really great third act, which is really important for having an exciting movie. So that's Moonrise Kingdom. Highly recommended if you have not seen it. But my favorite film of all time, if you've been listening to my episodes of the podcast, it probably does not come at a surprise. And this one is The Avengers, the first Avengers movie from 2012. This is one of my favorite films of all time. I talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but for context, I cannot remove the nostalgia from this movie. I can't remove my feelings from it because I saw this film with my dad in 2012 when I was 12 years old. And like a superhero movie, first of all, in theaters when you're 12 is like prime time to be watching a superhero movie. I think it was the second superhero movie I had seen in theaters. And it was like opening night. It was Friday at 7:00. And so people were like dressing up. This was at like the height of the superhero craze. I think now, even with Infinity War and Endgame, people are very excited, but people have kind of become superhero exhausted. At this point, like the cinematic universe was just being built, and seeing all these characters come together was so exciting. And it's a film that came out right towards the summer. It's action-packed, which is really important for having a summer blockbuster movie. It's not about the summer, but summer is a time for exciting movies, blockbuster movies that are like just fun. This movie there's not really any dark elements, realistically. There's a pretty like archetypical villain who is evil because he's evil, and it's mostly focused on our heroes who go through their ups and downs, but it is treated like a sitcom where they're like apart and together, or together, apart, together, and they all kind of have their own thing going on, but it's just really witty, really funny, again, very action-packed. It's the perfect movie to watch with a group because it's exciting, but there aren't a lot of plot points that like you'll miss if you're just having fun, laughing, and enjoying it with your friends. I'm assuming most people have probably seen it already, but if it's one of those ones from the MCU that you skipped over because it's a little bit more archaic maybe compared to more modern day superhero movies, I can't stress enough how fun it is. It's the perfect introduction to superhero movies. I think it's like the perfect superhero movie. I could rave about it all day. I love The Avengers, and I just think it's a really great summer blockbuster movie. So that's my number one. I just love summer movies. They're super fun. I think people have different opinions on what qualifies as a summer movie. I would hope all of these fall into that. I just think they should be movies that, whether or not they take place during the summer, they feel really warm, really exciting, action-packed, maybe funny, cute, just overall enjoyable to watch. So that's my list, and that's the episode. I hope you liked it. This was one of my favorite episodes to record because my opinions on these movies have either changed or may not be like the overwhelming consensus on some of these movies. Also kind of show just my biases in how I review things. And so I think it's important that you guys know that that's who I am, what I like about movies, and what makes a movie stronger or weaker to me personally will hopefully give you a sense of how you feel about these movies. And a movie that I might not like, you might love because you just don't agree with my opinions, and that's perfectly fine, and I think that's really great. And if that is the case and you feel that way, I would love to hear that from you. So tweet at us at GSMC_movies. That's the account that we're checking the most. We'd love to interact with you guys, and we would love to hear from you, hear your consensus on the episodes and some of your opinions or recommendations as a whole. So that's this episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review, because that really, really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.